My name is Joseph Callahan, and we are at KGEM TV in Monrovia, California. This is the Library of Congress Veteran History Project that's being conducted through the Monrovia Public Library. And we are interviewing today Richard Eugene McCubbins, a Vietnam veteran, and he will be asked a number of questions for this video today. But present in the room, we have Dennis Sanchez, Mabel Cross, Peter Nile, and Anthony Clegg. And we are going to start off with first telling you a little bit about Richard. He was born in Washington, D.C. on November 10, 1947. And Richard, would you tell us about your parents and how you came to be in Washington, D.C.?
Well, my dad was in the Navy. My mom and dad were married in 1942. My dad was working in the Navy Yard as a machinist and was called up in 1943, and he served in the Navy on a minesweeper. He was a machinist mate on a minesweeper in the Pacific Theater. Mm-hmm. Before he went, they had my sister, who was 4 years older than I am. She was born in 1943. And when my dad came home, he resumed his career at the Navy Yard and then transitioned into stepping up the ladder, so to speak, into the Navy Department. He made a career in the Navy Department. So that was sort of where the family grew up. I lived the first 6 years of my life in Washington. And then we moved to the Maryland suburbs, a place called District Heights, and that was when I was about 5 years old. So I spent most of my growing up years in Maryland.
We, oh, by the way, today's date is June 30th, 2017, and we're going back a few years. So the questions I'm going to be asking you are going back to, how did you come to entering the services, and why did you decide to enter the Air Force?
Well, my family was pretty much a Navy family. Most of my uncles, my dad, a lot of cousins were Navy men. So so I grew up with a pretty biased environment. Most of our family believed in military service. So did I, serving your country, giving back. So when I went to college, I had a presumption that after I got my degree, I'd go into the service. So the Navy was probably in the front of my thinking, but in my senior year, a buddy of mine at school told me about the Air Force and that they were looking for people who wanted to attend officer training school in the post-graduation years. So I went down and I took some tests in downtown Nashville. I went to Vanderbilt University, and I got a degree in electrical engineering. So in my senior year, I took some tests, and they said, well, it looks like we could use you. We want to get some more testing on you, physical testing. So I went down to a air base in south of Nashville, Stewart Air Base, I believe, and took all the physicals. And everything was great except my eyesight. My eyesight was just a little bit, it was 20/20, but it was a little off from astigmatism. So my depth perception was a little bit compromised. So the Air Force said, well, we'd like to offer you a position in this class at OTS in July, but you can't be a pilot. We'd like you to be a navigator. So I thought, well, that sounds interesting. So I signed the paperwork, I think, in March or so of my senior year. And all I had to do was graduate in the next 90 days, and I was good to go.
So tell us about when you first went in. You went into training camp, and share with us what happened to you there.
Well, training for the Air Force was at Lackland Air Base. There was the basic training for the enlisted folks, and there was OTS, Officer Training School, for those going into the officer corps. Basic training was 6 weeks. OTS was 12 weeks. And the first half of those 12 weeks, you were sort of we'll put it, you were bottom of the rung for the OT folks. And, you know, there was a little harassment, but it wasn't too bad. And
You
then,
remember the instructors?
Captain Atchley was our OT lead. We were sanctioned off into flights, and there was a Captain Atchley who was our hen mother, if you will, for about 15 of us. And so for the first 6 weeks, we were sort of the underlings, and then for the second 6 weeks, we were kind of superior to the underlings, but still kind of but it was a lot nicer. There were a lot more creature comforts. There was an occasional weekend we'd get to go down to San Antonio, things like that. And then I graduated and received my commission in September 29th, 1969.
Did you go directly from there to specialized training? And what was the specialized training?
Yeah, right after I graduated and got my commission, I went to Mather Air Force Base outside of Sacramento, California, for undergraduate navigator training. And that was a pretty interesting time. We got about 240 hours of flying in a T-29, which was the training aircraft of the day, and we had specialized instruction in aviation physiology, map reading, radar, day and night celestial, grid navigation, and LORAN, and a few others. So they're all the old school navigation techniques. And a lot of this was geared for, in those days, previous to global positioning systems, when you needed to take what you had to figure out where you were, particularly if you were flying over the North Pole, like from a base in northern U.S. to the Soviet Union. You would need to have some specialized techniques to navigate, because magnetic north is sort of meaningless when you're over the North Pole.
What was the military physical regiments and so forth like? How did you like the food? You know, what can you share with us about how you adapted?
Oh, it was great. We were. We had 3 flights in my group. Typically in the Air Force, if you have a group like a squadron, you'll have flights, which is how you carve it up to smaller groups. We had 3 flights in my nav class. 2 flights consisted of guys who were married, and I was in the other flight of bachelors. So it was kind of a wild bunch. And we had a lot of good times, but they had a cafeteria on base, and we were able to sustain ourselves. And I had a car, so I got a chance to go out and explore from Lake Tahoe down to Half Moon Bay and beyond. So it was a good time. Usually we had weekends off, so we would spend a lot of time in Tahoe, San Francisco, and up in the hiking in the Sierra, things like that.
Now, when you completed training there, did you go directly to combat operations? Or?
Well, what happened is that after 9 months, we got our wings. That was, I think, the 7th of July in 1970. About 3 months prior to that, the assignments came down. And we had maybe 50 guys in my class. And there were a lot of F-4s and some other aircraft. And I really wanted to fly a fighter, but additional to the going directly into an aircraft, there were some advanced training, bombardier nav training and electronic warfare training. Bombardier nav training was primarily geared toward guys going into B-52s, and it was really understanding the intricacies of a weapons release. Electronic warfare was a little bit different, but most of the electronic warfare officers were geared to B-52s as well. And the curriculum for the electronic warfare training was basically to understand the Soviet air defense systems, the shooters, learn the equipment, how to recognize signals in a clear environment, and how to counter those signals for bomber defense, those sorts of things. So I was thinking that probably I'm not going to make the Air Force a career, and I'd like to get the extra training So I selected the electronic warfare course. It was an additional 7 months at the Mather Air Force Base, and we had a lot of good training. We learned a lot about the real world electronic combat threat. We learned how to recognize signals through some of the equipment and to counter those signals. We had several simulators that were B-52 simulators. We also had roughly 90 hours of flying in a specialized T-29 that had some surveillance and jamming equipment on it. And we'd fly up to there was a ground base in Fort Bragg, California, that would have signals, and we could actually jam them there. So it was airborne practice. It was good.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you left there, you were then deployed. Is that correct?
Well, our assignments, like with nav school, about a couple of months before we graduated from electronic warfare training, our assignments came down. We had 11 guys in the class, and typically we were expecting a lot of B-52s. There was one B-52. The rest of the assignments were tactical aircraft. There were 3 F-105 Wild Weasels. There were 3 AC-130s, gunships. There were 3 DC-130s, which are the drone control C-130s. There was 1 EB-66, which was a jamming aircraft, and there was 1 B-52. So it was a big surprise for most of us. And the way you select these classes is it's kind of in your rank order of academic performance in school, and I was pretty high up, so I selected a F-105 Wild Weasel. That is an aircraft that's got a special mission, and it was a very important mission in the air war against North Vietnam, and I thought it would be an exciting challenge.
So where were you sent then in Vietnam, or were you in country, or
as soon as I graduated from electronic warfare training, I did 2 things. I went to Homestead Air Force Base in Florida for water survival school, and then I went to Nellis for a 6-week training class in F-105s in tactics.
You received a considerable amount of training.
6 weeks is not a whole lot of training. I had 20 whole hours in the jet. And for some of us lieutenants who weren't really used to pulling Gs, there was an airfield north of Nellis. Nellis is where I went, in Las Vegas, Nevada. And at the Lincoln County Airport, just north of Nellis, about 8-10 minutes flying time, the Air Force set up a range, an EW range. And they had a simulator for the SA-2 system. It's called a fan song. And we would fly up there and we'd fly around and see the actual signals come into the receivers on the aircraft. And we get a chance to experience looking at signals and running attack profiles on those signals, and learning to do this while maintaining a calm stomach. Some of us took a while, but we all got out of the 6-week course and the 20 hours of jet time, and we're ready to go.
So what base overseas were you deployed to?
We were deployed to Karat, Royal Thai Air Force Base. It's kind of in the middle of Thailand. There were several bases in Thailand. Karat was one of maybe 6 bases, and that was where the Weasels, the F-105s, were stationed. The Wild Weasel's job was to attack or suppress the SA-2 missile system, SAMs, that were attacking Allied forces. The SA-2 system consisted of two or three parts. There was a target tracking radar called the fan song, and we had specialized equipment on the jet that would recognize that signal and would even give us a relative bearing if the signal was strong enough as to where it was in relationship to our aircraft. There was a Guideline 2 missile. It was a 19-mile missile. It had a solid fuel solid fuel booster that would take it out to about 6 miles, and then a liquid fuel sustainer motor would take it out to its target. And it had a uplink signal that would detect where the missile was and try to home the missile in on the aircraft. So there was a lot of signals that the SA-2 system used. The SA-2 system was designed in the right after World War II by the German scientists that the Russians had captured, and it was originally set up to encircle Moscow and defend against B-52s. Roll the clock forward 20 years or so, and they were providing this missile system to the North Vietnamese. So we had a set of receivers on board the aircraft that would detect the signal, detect the missile guidance. We also had a missile that we could launch and home in on the Fansong radar. That was good news. The bad news was our missile went about 8 miles, and their missile went 19 miles. So we were sort of outgunned caliber-wise until the AGM-78 came along. The AGM-45 was the missile we initially started with. It's called the Shrike missile, developed by the Navy. It had about a 10, you could loft it to maybe 10 miles, but the AGM-78 had a substantially longer range, and that was gave us a little more leeway in our attack profiles.
Can you tell us about your first combat flight over Vietnam?
Yeah, we were supposed to. We had two avionics configurations in the aircraft, and most of the aircraft at Karat were in the F-105G configuration. There were a few in the F-105F configuration, and we were at Nellis. Most of what we studied and all of what we flew was the G configuration. So, and there were subtleties and differences in the avionics. Our first mission was supposed to be a daytime, kind of easy introduction to the theater mission. I drew a different mission. I had a nighttime mission, and it was in the old F-105F configuration, and it was pretty stressful. It was about 4 hours long, and most of my missions had been a little over an hour. So it was kind of longer, and it was with avionics that weren't exactly that familiar to me, and it was at night. And at nighttime is a whole different ball of wax for setting the lighting of the instruments. And so it was stressful, but I survived. We got back, and I locked my first mission over North Vietnam. My 21st hour of jet time was over North Vietnam.
Well, kind of give us a rundown on some of your missions in the flight areas that you went through there in North Vietnam.
Well, when I got there in the middle of '71, if you look back at the history books, the Rolling Thunder, the air campaign against North Vietnam, sort of ended in '67, and Johnson decided we would no longer bomb the Hanoi, Haiphong, above the 20th parallel. So the North Vietnamese were moving supplies, people, armament, POL, all the war-making things south. And as they were starting to populate the southern part of North Vietnam in preparation for the Easter invasion of '72, they were starting to beef up their defenses. You don't defend things if you don't want to, protect them. So we started seeing a lot more activity with guns, radar-directed guns, 37, 57, and 85 millimeter AAA. And we also started to see a lot more activity with the SAM systems. We lost our first jet in December of 1971. When our squadron operations officer, Bob Belli, and his backseater, Scott McIntyre, were shot down in Magia Pass. And Bob was recovered. He was pretty beat up because he had a late ejection, and Scott McIntyre was lost. He was killed in action. But discovered from that when before Bob left Thailand all banged up, he swung by the squadron and kind of discussed what he remembered of the engagement. And what he remembered is that he had very little time to recognize the signal from the fan song before the missile slammed into the jet. And his recollection, after the fact, was that they probably were changing tactics using surveillance radars to better cue the shooters. And the missile was probably in the air before the target tracking radar came on. And the target tracking radar came on just for probably the last 10 seconds or so for final guidance. And he said, watch out for that, because this got me, and this is probably a wave of the future. The North Vietnamese had several years to start developing and integrating their air defense network. MiGs and SAMs and surveillance radars and shooters were all getting better coordinated to fight, the war that we were conducting. So that was kind of a milestone, if you will, in the ratcheting of the war. After, in December of '71, there was a lot more activity going on. A couple of missions that I recall with some interest is that on the 5th of January, 1972, we got a frag as an assignment to go to Thanh Hoa, which is about halfway from the DMZ to Hanoi, and take out a air surveillance radar called the Barlock. We had our missile could be tuned. The AGM-78 could be tuned to the frequency of a Barlock, and we were asked to take out a particular Barlock that was probably pretty important in the air defense network, the integrated network that the North Vietnamese had set up. So without a whole lot of fanfare, we we were lead, and we had another crew that was second, our wingman, and we had two F-4s from another squadron that were assigned for MiG-cap, which is protection from MiG attacks. And off we went. There's a section of the North Vietnam called the Gorilla's Head. It looks like a profile of a gorilla. And we were orbiting in the lip of the Gorilla's Head, looking for the signal for the Barlock. And we had the sweeping signal, but I could not get the missile locked on the radar. And you had to have a good solid lock on, or else you wouldn't fire the missile. So after a few minutes of trying to get a good lock on, my pilot and I decided, well, we'll just cross the border. It was called protective reaction strikes. And we'd go in and we'd get a little closer so we could get a good lock on, which we did. We went in we're about 10 miles away from the site, got a good lock on, fired the missile, and we were so close to it, it just sort of fell off the aircraft and went down through the clouds. And pretty soon later, we believe that the Barlock went off the air. So then we gave our control of the flight, our leadership of the flight, to our number 2 man, because he had a missile. So we went back into what's called a fighting wing, which is you're about 5 or 6 ship lengths and slightly behind your lead. And he headed north. And when you're smoking along at 500 knots, it doesn't take too long to get pretty far. And within a minute or so, we were in the outskirts, the suburbs of Hanoi. And we saw the missile falling off his jet going in, as we found out later, on a Fansong system. We had another missile, the AGM-45, that was locked onto a Fansong, and we took the shot. So our new lead and the 2 F-4s peeled left back toward Thailand, and we did a 370 back to rejoin the flight. And about this time, we're getting MiG calls. What would happen is that the Navy and the Air Force had radars that would monitor MiG activity, and when there were MiGs in the air, you'd get a warning on the guard channel, 2430, that would give you an indication of the sound of the MiGs and their location. Mm-hmm. Bullseye was the call sign for Hanoi, and Blue Bandits were the call sign for MiG-21s. So we got a call that there were 2 Blue Bandits, Bullseye, 6 miles, 180, and we looked at it and said, that's about where we are. So we lit the burner, and the 105 could go real fast, not for a long time, but we stroked the burner and smoked out of Hanoi at about 1.2 Mach and got in some clouds, you know, to protect ourselves from the visual and IR signatures, and we got out. So we joined up with our the rest of the flight, and we refueled, and we went home. And about this time, as we're coming into the pattern, we get a call from the approach control, and it says, lead, go to command post channel. Well, this was kind of odd, so we went to the command post channel, and they said, well, when you land, stand by your airplane in the revetment. So we said, okay, so we went back and we landed, and we were met by the squadron commander and the executive officer, and they said, we need to go down to the wing headquarters and brief the commander on exactly what happened, because he's been getting calls from Saigon, 7th Air Force headquarters. So we went down there and we explained to Colonel Gabriel, who was the wing commander at Karat, what was going on and what we had done and why we had done it. And he said, okay, well, thanks, and you guys go back and turn in your parachute, because we went right from the airplane to the wing headquarters. So we went back and kind of forgot about it for a few days. And then we get a call that there's been a request by General LaBelle, the commander of 7th Air Force, for my pilot and I and our squadron commander and exec to go brief him and his staff at Tan Son Nhut. So being a first lieutenant, you know, I had never seen a general, much less briefed one. So we got on some general sent his T-39 up. It's an executive kind of jet. And off we went to Tan Son Nhut. And we were met by an intel guy, and he said, well, we're going to help you set up a briefing with the maps and all that. And the next day we spent about an hour with General LaBelle and several other generals, General Slay, General Jumper, General Cross, a whole bunch of these guys. And we basically briefed them on the mission. And General LaBelle, who was responsible for the initial frag of the mission, said, well, okay, well, thanks, guys. We appreciate your we appreciate you coming down and briefing us. And being a lieutenant, I said something like, well, General, I hope we didn't get you in trouble. And he said, well, son, next time you hear a Waterloo Red call sign, heed it. I said, okay. Waterloo Red was a call that the air surveillance guys on our side would call out on guard if they saw an airplane that was crossing into North Vietnam, because we weren't supposed to do that. But our rules of engagement in Wild Weasels was that for protective reaction, if there's a threat, we are allowed to cross the border. So we were, in our minds, you know, responding to our rules of engagement. But my pilot said, yes, sir. Next time we hear a Waterloo Red, we're turning around. We'll get out of town. So that was my opportunity to brief the general staff at Tan Son Nhut. There was another mission that was in February that was a little kind of sad. It's a little bit of Murphy's Law. We were initially fragged to fly as number 2. This was in the 17th of February on a mission in the panhandle of North Vietnam to support a strike mission. And as we're briefing with the guys who were lead, turns out that my pilot needed a check ride for flight lead. And the guy who was our number 2, Jim Cutter, was a Stanival pilot, so he could give these tests. So without thinking much about it, we just swapped positions. My pilot, Rich Friedenmuth, and myself, and Jim Cutter and Ken Frazier would just swap. We would be lead and they would be 2. So off we went to support the mission. And unfortunately, Cutter was engaging a SAM site north of the DMZ, and he got shot down. similar to the situation that Bob Belli had faced earlier in December. So we saw the dirty smoke of the airburst, and we didn't see the jet go down, but we couldn't get Cutter and Frazier up on. They were Junior 2 was their call sign. So Junior 2 was lost, and we stuck around and we started to organize the search and rescue, the SAR effort. And we kind of ran low on gas. So we went back to the tankers that were in Thailand to get some gas to go back in, and there were no tankers that we could get on. So we were pretty skosh on fuel, and we had to land at Ubon because that was the closest airfield that we couldn't get back to Karat. So all that the folks at Karat knew was that Junior 2 was missing, and that the crew was declared missing in action until we got further information. So when we got back to Ubon, we got on the phone to the command post and we straightened out the names. And fortunately, Cutter and Frazier were captured. They were captured alive, and they spent a little over a year as POWs in North Vietnam. So that was the good news. But I guess the message there was make sure the command post has got the right names and the right positions.
Oh, you formed friendships and camaraderie. Can you tell us with whom and a little bit about those relationships, the friendships?
You bet. There were, well, four of us lieutenants went into training together, and then we went over to Karat together, and we came back on the same airplane in the following year. And to this day, I still communicate and visit two of those guys, two of the three that were with me. Brent Danner, who lives in Reno, and Al Spires, who lives in Paso Robles. There's also an organization called the Society of Wild Weasels that I belong to, and every 3 or 4 years they have a meeting, and we all get together and rekindle some old friendships and camaraderies. But yeah, it was a very intense year, and there were a lot of people that you met and latched onto and continue to this day.
Now, during that time, well, what did you do for recreation, and how did you contact people back home?
Contacting people was by mail. I mean, there was no internet. There were a few people who were able to get on a ham radio and kind of talk through a ham radio operator. But for the most part, it was letters. My sister was a big supporter of me. She sent me little care packages of cookies and iced tea. There was a packaged iced tea that I liked, and it got pretty hot over there, so that was good.
And for recreation, did you have R&R?
We did. We had an R&R. I took my R&R, and my sister, right after I departed for Southeast Asia, she and her husband, who was in the Navy, came back from Cyprus, and they had a son, newborn, and they wanted me to be the godfather. So when I had my R&R, rather than go to Hawaii or other places, I decided to go back to Washington, D.C. So I took the transport from Karat to Saigon, Saigon to Hawaii, Hawaii to San Francisco, San Francisco to Washington. Long trip, but I got there and we had the ceremony. He was christened, and then I came home the same way, although it was a little rougher coming back because I was flying space available. And I should have realized that San Francisco to Hawaii in February was going to be a high demand, not too many available seats. So what I did is I was able to get a full fare ticket and wait in San Francisco, and there was an opening on a United airplane, and I was able to get back to Hilo, which isn't the island I needed to be on, but we got from Hilo to Honolulu, Hickam Air Base, which is where my transport was back home, through the good wills and graces of United Airlines.
Now, when you finished your combat tour duty, it was a one-year tour, wasn't it?
One-year tour. I flew 154 combat missions, and probably another dozen or so other missions. We had a thing called an FCF, functional check flight. So when an airplane goes into heavy maintenance and it comes out before it goes back online, if you will, you get a crew to go fly the airplane to make sure it's airworthy. And my pilot was cleared for that, so I'd go along for the ride and take engine readings and things like that. And it was kind of neat because we got to go up in northern Thailand and go, as we were a clean airplane, we got to go fairly high, and we got to do a mock run down the center of Thailand, so that was kind of fun.
You received some citations for your experience there. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Oh, the awards?
Yes.
For my tour at Karat, I received 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses and 14 air medals.
On when you completed that tour of duty, did you take some leave and then go to your next assignment? Because I understand you still had some time to serve.
Right. I still had some time to serve, and I was supposed to go back to Nellis, and I was supposed to be assigned to a training wing for wild weasels. And so when I got home, I took about a week or so off and went home, bought a car in Virginia, and then I drove back to Las Vegas. And when I got to Las Vegas, I signed in the personnel, and personnel said, well, we've changed your assignment. You're going to go to an F-111 wing. And I said, why? I don't want to. And they said, well, we've got 3 squadrons of 111s at Nellis. 2 of those squadrons are going to be deploying to Tak Lee, Thailand, to support the war effort. And we're reconstituting another squadron so that one of those that squadron can replace one of the 2 deployed squadrons in 3 months. And there would be nobody knew how long the war was going to last. So I protested a little bit, but in the end, I got reassigned to F-111s, went down to a training squadron, and took the academics. And then in October, I guess, of 1972, I started finally getting to fly the airplane, the F-111A. And this time I got a whole 80 hours in the jet before I deployed to Southeast Asia. The 111 was a tactical bomber. It was designed to fly low, anywhere from 200 feet to 1,000 feet above the ground at 480 knots, and to avoid the terrain. And we had a side-by-side crew. The aircraft commander was on the left side, and I was on the right side. And I had the weapons panel and all the radar, forward-looking and side-looking radar efforts, equipment. And so it was a real good crew effort, but if you fly along the ground at 200, 300, 500 feet at night in weather, it's pretty exciting. And we'd be on hot mic, and we'd be chattering all the time, making sure that we both know what's going on in each other's head. And I would be looking at the terrain. We had 2 radars, a terrain radar and an attack scope, and I would be kind of telling them what I'm seeing on the scope, because if I don't see anything on the scope, that means there's no terrain in front of us, which means we should be climbing. So anyway, we deployed. Our squadron got reconstituted. Most of the pilots were the aircraft commanders in the right seat were from F-100s, and most of the right-seaters were pilots, young pilots right out of pilot training, and then a few of us EWOs and navigators. So we deployed. The first 3 months that the 111s were in action, we lost 6 airplanes, and we lost 10 10 KIA and 2 POWs. So it was pretty tough mission. And these were the guys who had the experience. So we went over a little bit nervous. But as soon as we got there, operations were starting to be curtailed because after the linebacker operations in the late part of December of 72, when the B-52s struck Hanoi, they came back to the table, everybody made nice, and looked like there was going to be a peace accords. So my 6 months there, we worked with the Laotians, who were fighting their communist insurgency, and then we worked with the Cambodians, the Khmer, who were fighting their war with the Khmer Rouge. So we still had operations of 84 bombing missions, mostly in Laos and Cambodia.
You had one other assignment after that duty, did you not? You went to England, I believe?
Right. After 6 months at Tak Lee in 111s, I came back to Nellis and was just settling into a life in Las Vegas. And I got called down to personnel and was invited to sign my paperwork for an assignment to England. There was at that time one squadron of F-111s, F-111Es, at RAF Upper Hayford. RAF Upper Hayford is about 60 miles northwest of London, up in the Midlands. And there were 3 squadrons. It was the 20th Tactical Fighter Wing. There were 3 squadrons, and I got an assignment to go to England. So I said, well, this should be fun for a last assignment. So in October of 1973, I showed up at McGuire Air Base and got on a transport flight to go to England. And we had some exciting times getting over there, but due to weather. But I got to England and got situated at the RAF Upper Hayford, got introduced to the realities of the Cold War. And a lot of people, may not realize this, but there was a real Cold War going on, and there were a lot of people, submariners, land-based U.S. as well as airmen, who were on the front lines and pointing of the spear for the potential of nuclear warfare. And our job at Upper Hayford was the defense of the U.S. as well as defense of NATO against the Warsaw Pact. So most of our time was spent practicing for nuclear war or standing alert. I spent roughly a third of my time in England on nuclear alert, which is where you have an airplane that's in a Quonset hut, protected Quonset hut, with 2 B-61 nuclear weapons. And the airplane was cocked, so it could be started and taxied very quickly, and we could take off our targets if required. And that was kind of a sobering kind of environment to live in. When we weren't doing that, we had a lot of low-level flights in England. There was a route that went from the toe of southwest England down in Cornwall, Devonshire, went across the Bristol Channel up through Wales, and we'd end up at the Isle of Man. And there was a offshore bombing range that we'd practice bombing runs on. There were also some other bombing ranges on the east coast of England. Occasionally we'd get to go up to Scotland, and every now and then we'd go to France. And they had some low-level routes in France. Basically it was to keep your low-level flying skills sharp.
Now this is where you completed your active duty, is it?
Right. After 6.5 years, I thought it's time to rejoin civilian life. So I put in my paperwork, and in October the 9th of 1975, I flew back to McGuire Air Force Base. We landed, and 3 hours later I was a civilian and was out the front door.
Right. So how were you greeted at home by family and the community?
Well, nobody was really treated well by the community. My mother especially, I think, was a little bit stressed with the things I had been doing for the last 5 or 6 years. So my mom was was real glad. My dad was relieved. I had a girlfriend in Boston who was relieved, and so it was basically a non-event. I walked out the gate and went on with my life.
How did you readjust? Pretty well?
I did, yeah. I needed to get a job, and I knew that being out of the country for 4 years, and in 1975 was sort of the beginning of a recovery of a recession during the early part of the 70s, that it might be a little tough. But luckily I went to a couple of job fairs, and I got a job within 3 weeks in Maryland, and off I went.
Did any of your military training come in handy for your job application? Was it experience that was relevant?
Not initially. Initially, I was hired as basically a brand new engineer out of school, because there was no real. I guess it's kind of hard to relate flying fighters to a civilian world, but I did get a job in Maryland. It was with a branch of the Electronic Systems Division in the Air Force at Hanscom Field, and we worked on the early days of global positioning system, electromagnetic compatibility on aircraft. So I got to get my hands back into the engineering field, and it was really good. It was a good transition.
Some of the things that you've done since you separated from military life, what brought you to California, for example?
Well, after a couple of years in Maryland, the cold weather got to me. Plus, I wanted to find something a little more exciting than the analytical work. So I came out to California, and I worked for 6 years for General Dynamics in Pomona, California, mostly on Army programs, air defense gun systems, and the Stinger missile system, as well as some anti-tank systems. And then after that, for a couple of years, I worked at Northrop Grumman. Actually, Northrop at the time, on the early days of the B-2 bomber, I worked on the stores management system. But then I left for the Lockheed Skunk Works, and I worked for 25 years at Lockheed. Virtually all of my time on the F-117 stealth fighter. So there was a connection of being with aviators and knowing the job, the work, the effort. The F-117 again was a bombing platform for very tough air defense environments, and it used its low observability for survivability. So a lot of that kind of came into play with.
How did your wartime experiences affect your life?
It made me appreciate a lot of things that I never appreciated, and I was thinking about this a while back, and there was a lot of growing up that some people need help with, and I think I grew up a lot when I was in the service. I was probably maybe a little bit goofy, when I was 21 years old, and
so what are some
flying fighters kind of helps that out.
What were some of the life lessons you learned from the military?
Life lessons from the military, you probably need to. It's good to depend on a team if you have a big overarching objective. There's lots of things that are involved. For example, you learn that a fighter is no good if you don't have a dedicated crew chief, engine men, parachute shop guys, and the whole team to support that. You get a lot of sometimes you get a lot of the we'll call it not glamour, but a lot of the excitement. But there's a whole team of guys behind you who are working like crazy to put you there, and you're relying on them, and they step up to the job. So the teamwork, I think, it was really helped me in my life, recognizing, understanding, and appreciating all the contributions that everybody provides.
How has the military service impacted your feelings about war and the military in general?
Well, I was always pretty high on the military. I believe in a strong military, and I'm glad we have one. I think the United States is probably the only adult in the room when it comes to military power and the exercise of it. I'm also glad that we do some more thinking about things. For example, in Vietnam, when we entered the Vietnam War, we were totally unprepared for a tactical air operations against the highly defended area. We lost a lot of people in airplanes. So when the Desert Storm sorts of planning was done, and you'd watch CNN, there was a lot of talk initially about rolling back those defenses so that you'd be more survivable and lose fewer people in the execution of what you needed to do. So that was a whole total mindset change that was a lesson learned, and that was a good thing.
What message would you leave for future generations who will view this video?
Hard to say. You got it's something you have to work out yourself. But I think getting out and being on your own and getting experience, growing up, the military is and in other fields are dandy ways to do that, and to kind of displace yourself from your own personal satisfaction to kind of the greater good. And I really think that some service, be it military, Peace Corps, volunteering, whatever, is a good thing to do for a population in general, to basically give back, if you will, to the society that nurtures you.
Right. Well, thank you for your service, Richard, and thank you for answering our questions today on this video. Is there anything that you'd like to add, and your perspective on this project?
Well, I think it's good. I think it's good to get the as many veterans as we can. We're in a time frame now where our World War II veterans are starting to leave, and there's a lot of in the Vietnam, in the Korean and the Vietnam era veterans, there's a lot left unsaid because nobody wanted to hear it and nobody wanted to relive it. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of stories and lessons to be learned that are still out there, and I encourage anyone who has a story that they'd like to tell to see if they can get into this program.
All right. Thank you very much, Richard.
You're welcome.